And in terms of their impact on the countries they ran, which had the best and worst impact on the country's inhabitants?
That's a very interesting question, because in a way it's a wonderful example of the Lord giving and the Lord taking away. In some respect, if you think about welfare, inoculation of children, good postnatal care, the provision of hospitals and so on, you'd home in on the Belgian Congo after the fall of Leopold's control in the Congo. Here is a very bureaucratic state, a state in which there is a very high degree of involvement in the everyday life of people. There's a good deal of medical care, a good deal of sort of primary education extended to the population. And at the same time, the complete denial of any opportunity to educate oneself beyond primary school education. At independence, there's a famous statistic, I think, that says that there are 13, I think, graduates in the entirety of what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is a massive state, the size of Europe, because there was basically no secondary education in what was the Belgian Congo until 1960. The complete smothering of the emergence of a modern elite and of a modern civil society as a consequence. So on the one hand, you've got the complete paternalist state, but the paternalism is the paternalism of the pat on the head. It's the paternalism of keeping people perpetually as children. And in that respect, I think one could regard that as completely malign. The upshot, of course, is completely malign. The state falls to pieces in 1960-61 and is one of the world's great disaster zones to this day, and a great human tragedy, a largely unrecorded human tragedy in terms of the Western press. God knows how many millions of people have died in that place.
And how does that contrast with British and French imperialism in terms of impact?
There are two kinds of impact. This goes back to that dichotomy that I tried to make earlier between settler and non-settler states. Settler states are much more like the Belgian Congo in that people are preserved, conserved, reserved as labour, fundamentally. There's no real interest in their emergence as members of a modern elite. Their literacy is unimportant if they're farm hands and miners. Their ability to do maths and so on is unimportant, because basically the elite are provided, in the case of Kenya, by a shopkeeping elite that has come over from South Asia, and a ruling elite, both landowning and administering elite from Britain, a settler elite. So that's one way in which the impact is very, very marked. So at independence, Kenya does not have a great wealth of doctors, nurses, secondary school teachers, and so on. It has a stunted civil society in many senses. Whereas in West Africa, where you don't get, in British West Africa, where you don't get a settler presence, the ambition has been really really in the 1920s, I think, when poverty begins to be a very marked part of West African governance, because tax revenues are low. There is a growing impetus and growing emphasis upon the creation of an African elite who will take over some of the lower level bureaucratic functions, the lower level educational functions and medical functions over time, a process called Africanization. So that you find by the 1940s and 1950s the presence of a sizable elite of highly literate, highly educated people, professionally skilled, and so on. And this is a partial explanation of the early emergence of very sophisticated nationalism in these areas as opposed to the settler areas. So the impact is very, very divided and very distinct in that sense.
Ethiopia was a clear example of an African-grown empire. What does this tell us about the impact on its inhabitants and subsequent history?
Well, the impact on its inhabitants is, of course, an expansionist empire of a very old-fashioned sort that people who work on the history of the Aztec and the history of continental Europe are well used to in the early modern period. An expansionist empire which colonizes by defeating people, and it defeats people and then forces them in some senses to become more like the central power. So that you get a very much objected to agenda in the colonized parts of Ethiopia of what's usually called Amharization, not the forcible, but it is pretty much forcible conversion of conquered people into mirror images in some senses culturally of the conquering power, speaking Amharic, being Christianized in the ancient Christian rites of Ethiopia, and of course accepting the central authority of what becomes the capital from the 1880s, Addis Ababa. In that sense, it's an old-fashioned empire that is more like that of Spain's in the 17th century, for example. The impact on the populations, of course, is one of considerable resentment, and of course Ethiopia has been riven since its liberation, its self-liberation in many senses, from the Italians in the course of the Second World War, by internal disruption, leading of course to one of the very few examples of a successful divorce of a constituent part of that empire, namely Eritrea. But there are other insurgent forces within Ethiopia which are kept down as basically as conquered people.
What lasting cultural impact do the different imperialisms have upon their subjects? What mark has been left by?
The mark is extraordinarily profound, and much more profound than those of us who got into looking at Africa in the 1960s would have thought. I think most of us thought that colonialism was a passing thing, that it would disappear off the face of the map, and that Africa would become increasingly African, as it were, and would discard the robes of empire, the tattered relics of empire, pretty rapidly. But many aspects of empire have been very, very resilient. The most significant, I think, being cultural and particularly linguistic, in that there is still a huge division in Africa linguistically between the Anglophone states and the Francophone states. Very, very few, unfortunately, people in Anglophone Africa speak French and vice versa, which means that there is still a division in the African Union between the Francophone and the Anglophone. But that's been partly to do with a degree of what some would call neocolonialism, the remaining nature of the Franc zone in very much many parts of French-speaking Africa, and of course the absence of that in terms of what had been British Africa. There's no sterling area in British Africa. And the remaining dependence to some extent of bits of the operation of French-speaking Africa upon France. And as we're speaking to one another now, at the moment we're watching the intervention of the French Air Force and the French Army in a struggle in Mali to get rid of insurgent forces of a variety of sorts, which is being carried out from a French military base, standing long-term military and Air Force base in Chad, where France intervened not very long ago in another civil war. So the presence of France still in the politics of modern Africa is very pertinent. And I don't think that's mirrored in the case of Britain, which has really no real foothold. I don't think seeks any real foothold in modern Africa.